real quick here, we were talking about the arts and crafts movement and then Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie School and how his work fit into the larger genre of the arts and crafts. And one other architect firm that was made up of two brothers, Charles and Henry Greene, that I wanted to discuss briefly was the Greene and Greene brothers' work in California. And this is one of the first times we're going to talk about sort of architecture in California, which especially as the 20th century emerges, California becomes a very popular place. A lot of people are moving out there, and they had plenty of work as the area in Southern California, especially, and around San Francisco, was growing. And we'll see other examples of architecture in California as we talk more into the 20th century. But Greene and Greene were two brothers. Get to their photo here for you. There they are. Two brothers that moved out west where it's sunny and warm, and the life is good, I guess. That's the promise, at least. And like Wright, we talked about his influence of Japanese architecture, art, culture. Everything Japanese really was very influential to Wright. Both Greene brothers also were heavily influenced by Japanese architecture and especially Japanese carpentry, but in a different way. And this is a good contrast, like you'll be doing with your research. This would be a good contrast to understand how different arts and crafts architects, and even those inspired by same sorts of things, could come up with a completely different solution. And the main house I want to talk about is their most famous. This is the Gamble House in Pasadena, just outside of LA. Dates from 1908. And you've probably seen this before. It's a house museum now. It's featured in a lot of advertising, and it's even been in movies. In fact, the carriage house was in Back to the Future. That's where the scientist character or whatever that Marty that befriends or whatever, that's where he had his studio or whatever, was in the carriage house of this. So being in LA, they find cool sites to film movies and TV shows in. So anyway, this is the Gamble House. It has some of the characteristics that we talked about with Frank Lloyd Wright, but it is, I think clearly to you all, I hope, is not a prairie style house. It has a pretty low sloped roof, but it's not the hipped roofs that Wright generally did. There are some bands of windows. I know there's some shadowing. It's a little hard to tell in this photo, but there are some bands of windows, but there's not an overall emphasis on horizontality. That was something that Wright felt was an architecture, a theme that was fitting to the flat Midwestern prairie. Well, this is Southern California, where there's hills and mountains all around, and so there wasn't a need on the Greene brothers' part, I guess, to emphasize that horizontality. We also see, again, being in California, where it's the weather is delightful much more often in the upper Midwest, where we are. There's a lot more outdoor living space, and you can see on the far right this open porch with deep overhangs to kind of block some of the sunlight, but give you lots of outdoor shaded area to enjoy that great weather. Here's a slightly different view without so many of the harsh shadows, and you can see very, very deep eaves here. That's something that Wright was doing. And that is in many ways an early precursor to sustainable design, shading from harsh summer sun that would heat up the house, but in the wintertime, when the sun is lower and you want that warmth from the sun, the eaves would allow the sun to come in. So it's in many ways these RF's houses were early, sustainable green architecture. Green, just pardon the pun here with the Greene brothers, but you can see that has the bands of windows. Not quite as extensive. Wright would get to the point where he was creating almost an entire wall of banded windows or ribbon windows. Here they're banded together, but there's still sort of an opening within the plane of the wall. So there's a difference there as well. And the other thing the Greene brothers are doing is they're really emphasizing the craftsmanship. Wright, he had some incredible woodwork and detailing, but you'll notice the eaves all have the exposed rafters, and the rafter tails sort of extend out. We have the exposed beams and brackets. It actually is part of a style we call the craftsman style. I talked about Gustav Stickley and his Craftsman magazine and how that kind of lent the name to the craftsman style. Well, Greene brothers were really working in that more craftsman style, where it really emphasizes the carpentry, the joinery, and you expose it and express it in a way that even Wright wasn't really doing very much. And you can see the big open porch on the far right over here. The entrance is really fabulous, and this really shows some of the incredible woodwork. Again, we had talked an overall theme with the arts and crafts movement in general was using really quality wood, mahogany and cherry and walnut and other exotic woods, and exposing the grain, the natural stain and grain, rather than painting it or something like that. So here we're seeing that beautiful wood doors here with art glass windows on the inside. I'll show you a photo from the inside so you can see that art glass nicely. I also like the integration of nature. This is my photo when I took a tour, and you notice the brick steps. Look at the ivy vines that are extended along here. It takes a lot of maintenance to keep them from completely covering over the brick steps, but that's a neat way of integrating nature into their home, in addition to the natural scene of the art glass windows in the door that we can see from the inside here. So it's kind of almost a Asian Japanese style print tree here. So that shows some of that influence of Japanese culture and art as well, and a very much more organic approach to art glass windows than we saw with Wright's very geometric abstractions. This is a more naturalistic view. And the woodwork joinery also is very much inspired by Japanese carpentry. A lot of exposed tenons and joints, sort of curved forms. You can see it in the upper bracket here, the corner of the door, and you'll see a few other examples, are more akin to traditional Japanese crafts or carpentry. Here's a view of the living room with an ingle nook. I think I talked about ingle nooks before. The idea of you have a fireplace typically. Again, no need for a fireplace in southern LA in 1908. It's a decorative thing. You could still light a fire in them. Some people just have decorative fireplaces today, but really, on a cool night, it's great. But you didn't need it to heat the house for sure, and you certainly didn't cook and all that. But it was, it was symbolic. It was the warmth of the fire. The family can gather around here. You can see the couch in front, and the ingle nook is this niche that it sets in, and you typically would have benches, maybe bookcases or display shelves, and it really becomes the focal point of a living room. And we saw that with Wright's work. We saw that, in the examples, some of the other examples of arts and crafts architecture before, and you may find some of that in your research of Prairie School architects. This is the dining room. You see some of the art glass in the dining room chandelier there, and in the window over the sideboard that's built in. Very much an Asian, Japanese-inspired sideboard cabinet. You might see this almost similar to like a Chinese cupboard, and as well as the furniture. This is great house too. We talked about the Dana house being a fully furnished Frank Lloyd Wright house, very rare. The Gamble house remains fully furnished with the original furniture that the Greene brothers designed here as well. I should note that both Wright and the Greene brothers and many other of the arts and crafts architects of this era really believed in a full immersive design experience, that they just weren't designing four walls and a roof, and people would move in with their furniture and their art and their decorations. They often created a complete environment, the furnishings, the the rugs, the draperies, everything would often be designed by the architect, or at least artisans working under the guidance or direction of the architect. Frank Lloyd Wright was even known. There are stories that he would visit the homes of his clients, former clients, after they had moved in, and for a dinner party or something like that, and was known to sometimes take paintings off the walls or readjust the furniture because he was not happy with how his clients had decorated. And he was even known to dabble in fashion. I think he mostly only got his own wife to wear the dresses that he designed. But that kind of shows you the extreme some of these architects went to create an entire complete environment. It wasn't just about designing the walls and roof, and then they were done. This is just a great detail of some of the carpentry work in the joinery, with more very organic, very Japanese print inspired decoration carved into the wood, and they're even using the graining. Look at the various graining of the wood that is incorporated into the decorative element. That's really a hallmark of arts and crafts design, to really emphasize the materials, the pure raw nature of the materials is expressed here. And you can see some wrought iron brackets that are part of the fabrication here. These aren't necessary. I mean, these really become more decorative. One can certainly put woodwork together without iron brackets, but it kind of is one last little way to evoke the medieval character that we initially saw with the early arts and crafts back in England. So that kind of finishes off. I just wanted to give you a little taste of another firm doing arts and crafts architecture in the U.S. that were not inspired by Wright. They were doing their own thing out in California. They were probably familiar with his work and publications, but they were doing something really completely different. So that hopefully gives you a little sense of the kinds of things you can talk about when you give your presentation on other Prairie School architects. Okay.